that we're going to consider this morning. One of the 7 I am sayings in the Gospel of John, where Jesus really reveals and declares that, well, he is God, his divine identity as God's Christ. I am the light of the world is one of them. He brings the light of truth. He himself is the light of truth. There's another one behind us. I am the way, the truth, and the life. How many different ways can he say that I am God? It really is true. There's no other way we can take these sayings of Jesus. And so he's either an utter madman, he's either a slimy con artist, or he is the God of all heaven and earth, the creator and the judge of all. And Jesus declares through the Gospel of John, I am indeed the divine Christ. So we'll read John chapter 11, verses 25 and 26. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Now, here Jesus declares his role and his power to give life beyond death, beyond this world, resurrection life, eternal life. And then he says, do you believe this? And there's a question for us to consider this Easter Sunday, or any day for that matter. Do you believe this? You know, if we're Christians, we say, of course, we believe this. But what does it mean to believe this, really? What does it mean to believe in resurrection life? To believe that I have life beyond this world, that death is actually my passage to resurrection life, to a greater life. What does it mean to believe that? You know, over the last while, we've talked about faith a bit. What does the Bible mean by faith? And we've seen that it's not only the inner conviction and assurance of something, that inner certainty, it's also the outer certainty. It's how we live. It's the actions that come from our inner certainty. It's the inner certainty and the out. And to have faith in the Bible is to live by faith. And you can't separate the two. So what does it mean to live by faith in resurrection life? What does that look like? What doesn't it look like? What's the difference? What difference does it make in my life? And that's really what this passage is about. And so we're going to look at what's going on here in John chapter 11. Jesus is speaking to a woman named Martha. And many of you are familiar with this passage. Martha lived with her sister Mary, not Jesus' mother Mary, not Mary Magdalene, a different Mary, and their brother Lazarus. And they were friends of Jesus. Jesus would stay with them sometimes. And Lazarus had just died from an illness. And Jesus arrives, and Martha says, and we'll read here starting in verse 21. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Now, Mary and Martha had actually sent for Jesus because Lazarus had become very ill. And they were certain that Jesus would heal him. Perhaps even now Martha is still thinking that Jesus can do something. But that is not why the Son of God came to earth. He didn't come to improve or extend the life of this world. He didn't come to make our short stay here just a little longer or more comfortable. Rather, he came to give resurrection life, life beyond this world, life beyond death, life unending. Death is inevitable. It's the irreversible judgment of God on human sin. And God is a righteous judge. That judgment is right and it is good. And this life in this fallen world, this life that is full of corruption, that is full of suffering, that is full of futility, it's not what God intended. It must end. It must end. But God's purpose and desire for us is actually life. God is a God of life. God is a creator. It's all around us. It's bursting out us this time of year. But how can God's purpose of life and also his judgment of death both be fulfilled? And it's only by life through death. It is only by resurrection life. And Jesus came to give us life in the only way possible, and that is resurrection life. He says, go back, John 11:25. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Though he die, yet shall he live. Now, the problem, of course, is that people naturally focus on this life. It's all about hanging on to and extending life at any cost, and that's very natural for us. But this actually becomes a barrier to resurrection faith. Because we can't truly have faith in the resurrection life and still desperately cling on to this life and still fear death. Remember, having faith is living by faith. And so if we have faith in resurrection life, we must live by faith in resurrection life. And it's not that we want to die, but the resurrection is now our ultimate goal. It's what God has for us. It is the good that God has for us. And in fact, faith means living and working in this world and in this life to that end, with that end in mind. And we can't live by faith in resurrection life and also be all about clinging to this life. The two things are incompatible. And if you like, we have to put all our eggs in one basket or the other. It's Easter time. Maybe you've got some Easter eggs. You've got to put all your Easter eggs in one basket or the other. Right? But it's easier said than done. You see, we only get one basket in the great Easter egg hunt of life. And we have to put our eggs in one basket or the other. There's no cheating. Now, which basket are you putting your eggs in? You know, your hope, your fulfillment, your whole purpose in life. Which basket are you putting them in? The resurrection basket or the basket of this life? And if we want them in the resurrection basket, we have to actually take them out of the basket of this life and put them in the resurrection basket. But that's easier said than done, because there is a kind of bondage that holds people back from this. Being all about this life and fearing death is a bondage that keeps us from true faith in resurrection life. And we don't naturally trust that resurrection basket. You know, it's just pie in the sky when you die, maybe, right? I'll hang on to the basket of this life, even though it might be crumbling, even though I know the bottom will fall out one day and all those eggs are going to spill out anyways. You know, it's like those plastic bags they give you in the produce department at stores. You know, you don't know when you put your yam in there or your apple if it's going to actually stay in there or it's just going to fall out on the floor. But we'll just hang on to it because that's what we got here, and we're just focused on it, and that's what sin does to us. Hebrews refers to this as the power of death that is wielded by the devil. And Jesus' mission was to break that power, and he took on our flesh and blood to break that power. Hebrews 2:14-15 says, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things," right? He became flesh and blood like us, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. It was the mission and purpose of the Christ to spark resurrection faith in resurrection life, to deliver us from the bondage of the fear of death, to allow us to accept death, to even see it as our passage to resurrection life, to deliver us from the futility of seeking hope and fulfillment and all of that in the things of this world and this life, to allow us to live in anticipation of resurrection life. Now, Martha professes to have faith in resurrection life. We read in verses 23 and 24, Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." She professes to have that faith. Furthermore, she professes faith in Jesus as God's Christ, who will somehow make this possible. And in verse 27, we read, "She, that is Martha, said to him, 'Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world.'" And the Christ, understand, is the one who accomplishes all of God's work, God's salvation, God's resurrection life. Everything ultimately is accomplished through the Christ. And she professes faith that Jesus is the Christ, that he will bring this about. But does she really believe in resurrection life? Does she really believe that Jesus' great work is actually to bring about this resurrection life? Now, of course, we have to understand, Martha couldn't know how Jesus was going to do that. She couldn't know that Jesus was personally going to die and rise again, that he was personally going to die for our sins and rise again to bring that resurrection life out of death. She couldn't know that. Nobody knew that. Nobody anticipated that the Christ of God would die a humiliating death. We now know that is how Jesus did it. We now know this is the central pivotal act of all history through which God brought about his salvation. No one knew that before it happened, but they could still trust in God to provide that life and still trust in that resurrection life. And Martha claimed to have this faith. But does she? Does anyone here in this story have that faith? And that's the real need that is being brought out here. And Jesus is committed to meeting this need, so much so that what he did was that he purposely let Lazarus die. We go back to the beginning of chapter 11 from verse 1. "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, 'Lord, he whom you love is ill.' But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.' Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so that when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was." Jesus loved them, so he purposely let Lazarus die. He purposely delayed and let Lazarus die. Now, does that make any sense to you? Well, it did to Jesus. Jesus knows what he's going to do. Jesus knows this won't end in death. But to be of any lasting value, it must bring about resurrection faith. It must bring about faith in the resurrection life that he came to give. And Jesus wants them to get it. He desperately wants people to get it. He wants us to get that. Resurrection life is what he provides. That's his whole mission. But Jesus here, he's up against this bondage of the power of death, of the fear of death that is in people. Now, Martha's sister Mary comes to Jesus next. We read in verse 32. "Now, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.' When Jesus saw her weeping, And the Jews who had come with her also weeping. He was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" And so Mary comes at him with the same words as Martha. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And the people around her saying, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind have saved this man from dying?" And there's only a sense of loss. There's only a sense of what might have been. There's only a sense of Lazarus. He could have been kept from dying. That's what it's all about. And there's only weeping, and there's only sorrow, and there's only loss, and there's only mourning, and there's only despair. There's no sense of hope. There's no sense of future gain. There's no sense of resurrection here at all. Where is resurrection faith? Where is the hope of being raised on the last day that this household professes? That's what this is about. It's not the way it should be here. It's not the way people of God should be. It's not the way people of faith should be. And this really troubles Jesus, and we read he was greatly troubled. Greatly troubled. This was disturbing. This was not right. This is not as it should be. It disturbed him. And this sense is amplified in two other words that we have in this passage, but they don't necessarily come out very well in our English translation. And one is that along with being greatly troubled, it says that Jesus was deeply moved in his spirit. And the common translation here, deeply moved, and it's not incorrect, but it gives the impression, right, of being sort of empathetically in sorrow with them and grief. But the word actually means, and every other place it's used in the Bible here, it means to be angry or to be outraged or to be indignant. Yes, deeply moved, but in a different direction than they were. The King James Version has groaned. It's a little better because maybe you can see groan as being somewhat indignant. And there are actually a few translations that do put the word anger in here, by the way, just so you know that I'm not making it up. You go to the New Living Translation, actually, I'll give them credit. A deep anger welled up within him is the translation. The Contemporary English Version, he was terribly upset. And that really captures the idea. And it gives a different slant. Now, perhaps it doesn't fit with the popular notion that we've developed of Jesus. And translations, by the way, are under great pressure to make translations that people like, and they're very hesitant to do this kind of thing. But the idea here is Jesus is actually disturbed and angry. Now, at what? What is he disturbed and angry about? Well, not at death, because God's judgment on sinful mankind is death. In this case, he intentionally didn't prevent the death. What is he angry at? He is angry and he's disturbed at the reaction to death here. The lack of faith in face of death. He's angry that all he hears is mourning and wailing. He's indignant at the desperate, despairing clinging to a fallen world and a fallen life in the face of God's promise of resurrection. The second word I want to bring out is the fact that in verse 35, Jesus wept. Now, there's something else that we can't really see in our English versions, and that is that there's a completely different word used for Jesus weeping than everyone else is weeping here. It's not the same word. Jesus weeping, it's meant to show, is different. Now, the weeping that is used for Jesus is usually a weeping of lament, often before some tragedy strikes, typically because God has to judge for unbelief and for unfaithfulness. And it's hard to bring out the difference in an English translation because what other word are we going to use, right? We don't really have another different suitable word for weeping. Would you say Jesus shed tears? It's difficult. But Jesus' weeping was not their weeping. It's not weeping in sorrow and loss like they were. Now, the people thought Jesus was weeping out of this. See how he loved him, they said. Now, the thing is that Jesus did love. And he did love, and his weeping was out of love, but it wasn't a love that merely empathized with the grief and the sorrow, because it was rather a love that sought their greater good. And it was his anger as well that was out of love, because he cared. There's an anger that comes when loved ones refuse something for their good, and you see that, you just want to shake them, and what's wrong with you? When they turn away and they reject what is for their good, what is provided for them, maybe what you've provided for them. And it's frustrating, and it's disturbing, and it's aggravating, and it's maddening, because you care. If you didn't care, you wouldn't feel anything. But the fact is that empathizing and weeping with them won't do them any good. It only confirms them in their unbelief. It only enables them in their unbelief. Jesus, yes, he is a high priest who sympathizes with our weaknesses. He understands. He became completely human. Hebrews 4:15 tells us that. But at the same time, he never succumbed. He never gave in to our weakness. Rather, he's God, whose thoughts are above our thoughts. They're not our thoughts. Whose ways are above our ways. They're not our ways. Isaiah says, 55. He works to elevate us above the mire of lost and fallen humanity. He wants to lift people above what's going on here. And snap out of it, Jesus is saying. Where is your faith? Now, of course, there's some weeping when we lose loved ones, but we weep over our loss, not theirs, right? They're believers. And where there's faith, there must also be hope and rejoicing. We rejoice over their gain, over their resurrection life. And I would hate to think that my death would bring about a scene like this one day. I mean, I'd hope there'd be some sorrow. I don't want just rejoicing. Yeah. But I would hope that people could rejoice that, finally, I've reached my goal, and be encouraged in the Christian life. Thankfully at Christian funerals and Christian memorial services, that's usually the case, and you get that sense of rejoice and victory as well that comes through it. Now, of course, it's not only that. There is the way we face the possibility of death. When we have to pass through that valley of the shadow of death, Psalm 23 puts it. And again, there can be weeping and there can be sorrow against, possible loss, maybe as we face the prospect, the loss of relationships in this world, the loss of the good things of this world, and still there are good things in this world. God created this world good, even though it's fallen. And we feel that loss as we look toward leaving this world. And perhaps there's some fear and some anxiety about what we have to go through. But, there must also be the prospect of a far greater gain. Resurrection faith must overcome all of that. And, I think maybe Christians fail more often here. And you just get the sense that they are desperately clinging on to life, and you don't really see a whole lot of hope toward the prospect of resurrection life. Sometimes it seems as though, death is the worst possible thing, even a shameful thing. We need to show faith in God. We need to show faith in God's wisdom, in God's power, in God's timing. Of course, we do what we reasonably can to preserve our life. They're given to us by God But we also realize that our lives are taken by God as well. And our faith in the resurrection needs to shine through. Though we die, yet shall we live, right? That's our goal. And we live in a much greater way. And I'm thankful for brothers and sisters in the faith whose resurrection faith shines through when they're walking through that valley and facing the prospect of leaving this world. And when they do so with resurrection faith, they really are shining lights. And that is a great encouragement in the Christian life. And we can see that then ultimately resurrection faith actually ends up elevating our experience of this life. It gives it a degree and a quality of life that is otherwise lacking, no matter what we put into this life. In a way, we experience something of that resurrection life here and now when we have resurrection faith. It seeps in, it works back from the future, and it colors and it transforms our life here. And you see the difference. Now, we said earlier that Jesus didn't come to improve or to extend this short earthly life in this fallen world. Rather, he came to give us resurrection life. But the fact is, a resurrection life ends up improving this life by elevating it. So that also is part of Jesus' purpose for us. And in a way, we already possess resurrection life when we have resurrection faith, because we are living by that faith. It is part of our life. And Jesus brings this out in his I am saying. And we'll go back to that saying there, verse 25 and 26. Notice he says, whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Well, that is future resurrection life, right? But then he says, whoever lives, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. What does he mean there, everyone who lives? Everyone who's physically alive? Well, I don't think he has to tell us that we have to be physically alive to believe. He's talking about the present. Now, when we believe, we actually possess resurrection life in a way. He's bringing this out. We already have, in a sense, that resurrection life, that spiritual life, and it is very real in us. And it is evident, and it transforms our lives. And you see, that's what's missing in the household of Martha and Mary. That's what's missing. And Jesus now is going to do something about it. So we read in verse 38, then Jesus, deeply moved, and Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he's been dead 4 days. And Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Everyone with resurrection faith is going to see the glory of God in the end, in a way that completely outstrips anything we experience in this world. And in a sense, we do get a sense of the glory of God as well, even in this life when we have resurrection faith. But Jesus now is going to perform a sign to testify to that resurrection life. Verse 41. So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! And the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead to spark resurrection faith. And we're told in the next verse that as a result, many of the Jews believed in him. But the problem is in the Gospel of John, we're never really quite sure what kind of believing is going on. There seems to be a whole lot of partial believing and so forth. And that's the problem with signs. You have to see them as signs and not ends in themselves. They're signs that point to something greater. What is this pointing to? So the triumph is not that Lazarus was resuscitated back to this life only to die again. That's not the point. Rather, the triumph is what this points to. It's a sign. It's pointing to resurrection life, the life beyond this world, eternal life. The purpose of the sign is to verify Jesus' words. I am the resurrection, right? And the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. In the newsletter, those of you who read it, I kind of brought out that point that Lazarus, when he rose with those grave clothes still clinging to him, right? Even the cloth around his face. He had only temporarily eluded the grave. He would live to die again, as we all will. But Jesus, however, when he rose, right, we heard it earlier on from John, he left the grave clothes behind. They were all lying there. And the face cloth, he even neatly folded it and put it beside. Jesus was done with death and the grave. And our faith in Jesus is faith in his ultimate and final triumph over death, and a resurrection that leaves death and the grave behind forever. And that's the triumph of God. And that's the triumph we're called to live by. And so what difference is it making in our lives? What difference? Jesus' words, do you believe this? Do you believe it? Let's pray. Father, indeed we are in awe of the triumph of God to go through death and emerge in life. We're in awe that the Son of God would even come to do that for rebels, those who had turned against him, those who assert themselves. And self-will has become the great rallying cry now of fallen humanity, and we all live with that natural desire. And yet, Jesus humbled himself and came here to go through death for us. And we thank you for that, and we thank you for the great victory that he emerged completely victorious over death, over the grave. He left those clothes behind. He rose again and ascended back to heaven and lives now evermore for us at the right hand of the Father, holding that life that is ours. One day we will come into that fully. But even now, as our faith is focused there, it does transform our life. It does change us. It does give us a hope. It does give us a purpose. And it does free us from that bondage of the fear of death. May we all see that as our ultimate goal and our ultimate passage to all the good that you have for us. And yes, we experience some of that good here and now, and we're thankful for that. But there's so much more to come. We thank you for the truth of the resurrection. We thank you for resurrection faith and the life that it gives us. We pray